Well, we knew today would be the day. We expected Governor Little would take his full 5 days to decide if he would sign into Idaho law a bill that would ban abortions after 6 weeks and would also allow family members of the woman who gets an abortion to sue the doctor who performs the abortion. Governor Little let everyone know he signed Senate Bill 1309 and 1358 at about 1:15 this afternoon, about 30 minutes before the deadline. This legislation is based on a bill that recently passed in the state of Texas. Supporters are applauding it as a major win for pro-life policies. The outcry from critics, this will leave major concerns about women's health resources and the ability for a woman to get a safe abortion, since the ability to get one is still the law of the land, still legal in the U.S., despite several states that have instituted severe restrictions. For what this means, we turn now to Chief Political Reporter Joe Paris. Joe, Governor Little also included some interesting comments in his transmittal letter that he signed today, explaining why he signed this bill.
Yeah, and we're going to get to some of those comments that a lot of people have been chatting about online this afternoon in a minute. But again, as Brian recapped in short, if you're unfamiliar, this new law will ban abortions after 6 weeks of pregnancy. And there are some exceptions to that, and we're going to touch on that in a moment. And aside from the 6-week abortion ban, though, as Brian alluded to, the bill also allows for the father, grandparents, siblings, aunts, and uncles of a quote-unquote preborn child to each sue an abortion provider for a minimum of $20,000 in damages within 4 years after an abortion. There is an exception in cases of rape or incest, however. A woman who seeks an abortion in that specific situation has to file a police report and present it to the medical provider before getting an abortion. And critics have pointed out how difficult that process is alone, and it may prevent women from going down that path altogether. Now, the legislation does prevent rapists from filing a lawsuit over an abortion, but a rapist's relative could, in theory, file a lawsuit under this new Idaho law. Now, advocates for safe abortions and women's health resources say that the law creates a large variety of issues. Chelsea Ganoa Lincoln, Idaho Program Manager for Legal Voice, explains their biggest concern.
I would say access. We have seen such a chilling effect on people still being able to find and access safe legal abortion care in states like Texas. And when Idaho only has, those 3 providers, clinics by Planned Parenthood, we know that the devastating impacts are going to happen here in Idaho are likely sure to come, since this will be coming into effect in 30 days. We're not going to stop fighting for people's bodily autonomy. We're not going to stop fighting to make sure that people have access to safe and legal abortion care, even if they're having to flee Idaho. So we're still here.
We reached out to the sponsors of the legislation to talk to them about it for their perspective and the reaction. They say that this is a major victory for pro-life supporters. Now, lawmakers, though, they were working late at the State House today, so we haven't had an opportunity to check in and do an interview with them just yet. We are going to circle back later this week, though, for their full insight. Now, at the start of the day, Governor Little had 3 options on what he could do with the bill. He could sign it into law, he could veto it, or he could not sign it, and it would become law by default technicality. But Little did sign it into law shortly before the deadline, and he had some interesting notes of the enforcement mechanism in the law. He said, quote, "I fear the novel civil enforcement mechanism will, in short order, be proven both unconstitutional and unwise." In another statement, Little also expressed significant concerns over, quote, "unintended consequences that the legislation will have on sexual assault victims," saying, quote, "Ultimately, this legislation risks re-traumatizing victims by affording monetary incentives to wrongdoers and family members of rapists." Finally, Little finishes his letter saying, quote, "I remain committed to protecting the lives of preborn babies and strongly encourage the legislature to promptly rectify any unintended consequences with this legislation to ensure the state sufficiently protects the interests of victims of sexual assault." Will there be a legal challenge to this? Likely, yes. I know that stakeholders are discussing their next options, but to be clear here, for the next 30 days, abortions are legal in the state of Idaho. And Brian, again, 30 days starting tomorrow, that's when the law goes into effect. This is different than the fetal heartbeat bill that was passed a year ago. That went into effect when a federal court or a higher court would essentially overturn something like Roe v. Wade. So this has nothing to do with that. This is a totally separate law. Again, goes into effect in 30 days. There's a lot of conversation going on about lawsuits, but a conversation that is also being had is that until that the law goes into effect and you have a quote-unquote party who would sue over this, right, you have to wait until that point. So will we see specific lawsuits here in Idaho over this? Likely yes. Probably in the May or June timeframe.
Okay, so yeah, there has to be an injured party to bring a lawsuit that would take this up to a higher court that would then say this is unconstitutional, which is what Governor Little wrote in that. And this is interesting. Again, one more time he's done this where he's written this, here's why I don't think this is the right bill, but I'm going to sign it anyway and let the courts decide how this plays out.
And this was a very delicate decision for Governor Little, who, of course, is running for governor. He's running for re-election. And the statement that he made by signing or not signing or letting it go into effect would be very powerful and would have a lot of, I guess, implications with it. So we saw what the governor decided to do today. It'll be interesting to see how this plays out over the next several weeks, but also something to keep an eye on this summer. The Supreme Court, the federal Supreme Court, is expected to make a decision on Roe v. Wade. Depending on what happens there, could really have implications for Idaho.
And that's when that trigger law that has already been passed last year would go into effect. All right, thanks. So we know this is, as I mentioned, isn't the first time that Governor Little has expressed his trepidation, but went ahead and signed this bill anyway. He did it last session with House Bill 377. That was the one that outlawed the teaching of critical race theory in Idaho, even though it's not being taught in any of our schools in Idaho. He wrote a one sentence supporting that bill and then 6 paragraphs saying why he does it. Then there was the voter initiatives bill admitting it will likely end up in court, but he signed that bill anyway also. And then, of course, Idaho Supreme Court ruled it was, in fact, unconstitutional last summer.